So the National Prosecuting Authority has confirmed it's received money from Steinhoff to assist with a forensic probe into the company's auditing scandal. That confirmation coming through yesterday. However, the legal body insists that the transaction is not a conflict of interest. Now, it's been widely reported that Steinhoff agreed to give investigators from the Hawks and NPA 30 million rands to finance the investigation into the immense fraud at the company because the state, wait for this, simply doesn't have the budget. For context and I guess some analysis, let's bring in Rob Rose, who's editor at the Financial Mail. Rob, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks so much for making time. I mean, is this as bizarre as it seems? In a context where we know there's no such thing as a free lunch, how on earth are we to believe that this type of arrangement won't at the very least compromise the investigation itself?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I don't think that there's any easy answers here. It's a tricky situation because clearly the NPA doesn't have the forensic skills to be able to do a complicated investigation like Steinhoff easily. So they need an outside assistance. I think the problem comes in when they're allowing the company Steinhoff, which is being investigated, to finance this. There's so many potential pitfalls here. I mean, for example, if Steinhoff is financing this and the investigation leads to people at Steinhoff that haven't been, but are still there, Steinhoff could just say, well, we're not going to finance this anymore. And the other thing that it raises is that essentially it does mean that justice and accountability could be up for grabs. I mean, the companies who can fund investigations could get resolution on their complaints, and smaller companies who can't afford to finance it would be left out on the cold. So I think those are some of the potential implications. I don't think it's something you'd want the NPA to be doing too often, that's for sure.
I'd argue it's something you don't want the NPA to be doing at all. I mean, if there was need for external assistance, surely there are other, call it, channels outside of Steinhoff?
Yeah, absolutely. But I also think that in the context of how the state spends money, 30 million rand to get resolution on the largest corporate fraud in South Africa's history is peanuts compared to one of the articles we wrote about, use the comparison of buying plots of land that nobody can use for 118 million rand. So if you're willing to splurge money like that, 30 million rand to get resolution on Steinhoff, you'd think would be, small change, really.
Yeah.
To outsource this to the private sector finance, I think it's a road paven with conflict of interest and pitfalls.
Exactly. And, part of what Steinhoff is saying in its defense is that having this investigation seen through is actually in its own interests. But would that be the case in a context where not enough has been said to at least remove the concerns around how this probe is irretrievably contaminated by the conflict of interest you've just mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is we don't quite know where it's going to lead. And certainly, 106 billion rand fraud, you'd imagine that their tentacles go quite deep with people who might still be at the company. So who's to say that people still there aren't going to be implicated? So, a situation where the company is effectively financing the investigation of itself, it sounds as bad as it is, really.
I wonder where the indictment falls, though. Steinhoff being opportunistic, according to some people, by stepping into the fray this way, or our government itself for A, approaching Steinhoff for help, but B, not having this capability themselves to see through an investigation of this nature.
Absolutely. But you also think that, sure, you can imagine a company saying, well, how can we fast track this? Can we give you some money to help? You could imagine, as the Hawks and NPA, you would say, no, we can't afford to do that because of the governance issues around that. So you can see how they could have played it far differently in that case. And that's how it should have been done.
We also know that German prosecutors have now stepped into the fray in some respects. They've finally moved, I think, to press charges was the development. I wonder how we should read into that, given, I guess, the strides that are supposedly being made to try and put this to bed in South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, the Germans have been investigating before South Africa, actually. I mean, they started the investigation in 2017. And it was actually the fact that details leaked out of the German investigation that sparked some of the issues in South Africa in 2017 and led to the company's collapse. The auditors, Deloitte, refused to sign off the statements, the financial statements, because of what was emerging in the German investigation. But it still looks terrible, but it's a South African crime and it's our biggest corporate fraud. And the Germans have issued an indictment. We're not close to that at the moment. So I think that looks terrible. We need to be seen to be acting on this. We need to be seen to be acting quickly. it's 3 years after the fact. I mean, that's already too late in many people's eyes.
And I wonder how much that will compromise the investigation, Rob. 3 years is a long time to try wipe off footprints, hide whatever evidence there might be, and make this even more complicated for a state that we know is incapacitated in trying to solve this to begin with.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that, look, it is a complicated crime. One element of it is pretty complicated, the fraud itself. The insider trading stuff is a lot more simple, and you certainly think there could have been some kind of resolution on that before now. But you're right, 3 years is, in comparison to global investigations and in comparison to what we need to be doing to be able to say to foreign investors, look, when things happen that are bad in this country, we can deal with it and we can make sure that we have a strong operating environment in which there's accountability. And I think that it's important optically as well as practically to be doing this kind of thing. And I think a 3-year time frame isn't great.
Has something like this ever happened in the world of finances, for lack of a better term? A company essentially funding an investigation into itself?
I haven't seen it. I've spoken to people at the NPA and they said this has happened to some extent, but I have never seen something like this. And a lot of the law professors and the experts I spoke to, the first response was, sorry, say that again? Steinhoff's doing what? I think they found it quite surprising. Just like I said, the fact that it's contaminated by these conflicts of interest would suggest that it wouldn't happen too often and it shouldn't happen too often, and hopefully it doesn't again.
I mean, I'll admit, I read the headline several times because I thought I must be missing a word, a phrase, I must be misunderstanding it. So, okay, it perhaps is unprecedented, and that's why we're all scratching our heads in the ways through which we are. That said, though, what are the prospects of getting this done without some kind of help from somewhere? The impression is that the help is needed. There's no debate around that. The question then becomes, who's best placed to provide that help, if not a company like Steinhoff that's essentially saying, hey, guys, we're here, and this is how much we're offering?
Well, I think the thing is, what actually happened is that PricewaterhouseCoopers did a forensic investigation for Steinhoff. Steinhoff then handed this forensic report to the Hawks and the investigators, and that's when they said, well, this is great, but we can't afford to hire these guys. And that's when Steinhoff said, we'll pitch in with some money. The fact is, if it's just the financial amount, the 30 million, the fact is the NPA just has to pay up for that. The consequence of not doing it, not prosecuting this crime, is so huge that, and compared to how we spend money on other things, it really is small change. So to avoid the conflict of interest, you need to pay up for your big investigations. You need to make sure that they happen, and that you can show to people in the country that when people overstep the boundaries and commit fraud in our corporate sector, that they're held to account. I mean, you also don't want to. You also don't want a situation where you feel that the public sector is perpetually being hauled to court and the private sector is unaccountable. That's another element to this. And you can't have, the fact that the BBS guys have been arrested and nothing has happened on Steinhoff it isn't right at this point.
Absolutely. Yeah, getting to the bottom of this case is important symbolically, at the very least, to your point. But it does also bring home an idea that's been, or point that's been made in the public domain several times. I mean, this is the real cost of having institutions like the NPA completely hollowed out. We find ourselves in situations where crimes that have obviously been committed are impossible almost to prove in legitimate ways. I mean, we're finally dealing now with the real crux of what we meant when we said the NPA ought to be protected, because when it gets to these type of moments, the situation is left undesirable at the very least for the South African government.
No, that is true, but actually it's been denuded of skills for a long time before this. The Gary Porritt case, the Tygon case, the guy was arrested in 2002, and that case is still dragging through the courts. There's still no conviction on that. The Brett Kebble case, for example, massive fraud in that instance, and nobody has gone to jail for it. So long before this, we had trouble putting white-collar criminals behind bars. And it's only made it worse in the last 10 years when the NPA was denuded of skills, and anyone with good skills was poached by the forensic accounting companies who can pay higher salaries, and there's a stronger career perhaps in those companies. So I think that it has accelerated, but we have been dealing with this for a long, long time.
For the sake of balance, I must mention the NPA says safeguards have been put in place to ensure there isn't, I guess, any kind of conflict of interest. But should we be worried about the precedent this sets if it does go ahead?
In this case, they did say that there are these safeguards, and they make sure that Steinhoff has no insight into the investigation. It can't call the shots at all. And that's important to have those in place. But I do think the point you just raised, that it could be a precedent for future investigations where the NPA would say, well, how are we going to afford it? Can you pay up? We mustn't let that happen. That's not something that should be acceptable. So this is, I think, where we draw the line at this.
An incredibly interesting story indeed. I guess we're going to have to watch the space. I mean, your take on what happens next?
I mean, I really do believe that there will be accountability in the Steinhoff case. I think that people will go to jail and there will be consequence. And I think that'll be very important because, like I said before, there's the Tygon case from 2002. So I think this could be a watershed if we're able to nail a complicated financial fraud for people in jail. It will be seen as a positive thing. But we must do it.
Yeah.
We must not hang around too.
I guess the question becomes, do it at what cost? Rob Rose, thanks very much for your take on this really incredible insights. He's the editor at the Financial Mail. Thanks very much indeed.